They tell you the Roman Empire fell in 476 AD. They whisper about barbarian hordes, weak emperors, and the slow, inevitable creep of darkness. But they are lying to you. They are hiding the deepest, most astonishing truth about history's greatest superpower. Rome did not fall. It simply migrated. It performed the most audacious, high-stakes geographic relocation in the history of civilization, abandoning the old, corrupt, cursed city on the Tiber for a new, unstoppable fortress on the Bosphorus. Can you believe the sheer, terrifying arrogance of this move? Imagine deciding that the heart of the world, the city that defined power for 1,000 years, was suddenly obsolete. This wasn't a retreat. It was an extreme declaration of dominance, a move so risky it should have triggered immediate civil war and total collapse, yet it somehow, impossibly, worked. This is the saga of the Byzantine Empire, the 1,000-year miracle that history textbooks desperately try to sweep under the rug. This is the tale of the ultimate survivor, a civilization that endured plagues, earthquakes, fanatical armies, and the internal religious strife that threatened to tear its very soul apart. We are diving deep into the golden halls of Constantinople, the city the world would come to call the Queen of Cities, the glittering jewel that preserved the flame of civilization while Europe slid into what we so dramatically call the Dark Ages. But before the glittering mosaics and the towering Hagia Sophia, there was a man, a single, terrifying figure whose ambition was so vast it reshaped the map of faith and power forever. Constantine the Great. He wasn't just an emperor, he was a revolutionary who rode into history on a tide of blood and divine intervention. And then, the vision. A catastrophe no one saw coming, a celestial sign that turned a standard Roman military campaign into a holy war that would define the next millennium. Whether you believe it was a divine miracle or a brilliant piece of political theater, the story goes that Constantine looked up just before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge and saw a sign in the sky, a cross, or perhaps the Chi Rho symbol, blazing with the inscription, "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign, conquer. He painted the holy monogram on his soldier shields. The battle that followed was not merely a victory, it was an annihilation. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber, weighed down by his own armor. When Constantine entered Rome, he didn't celebrate the old gods. He subtly began to dismantle them, paving the way for a radical, new monotheistic faith to inherit the empire. But Rome was tainted. The ghosts of the Republic and the endless, suffocating traditions of the pagan past clung to the marble in the Senate. Constantine realized that to truly create a new empire, he needed a new beginning, a spiritual and logistical reset button pressed far away from the toxic politics of the West. He looked east. He looked toward a strategic choke point that was geographically untouchable, the ancient, humble Greek city of Byzantium. Its location was a miracle of military defense, surrounded on three sides by water, sitting astride the single most important trade route in the world, controlling the gateway between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. This wasn't just city planning. This was military genius, bordering on obsession. For 6 frantic years, starting in 324 AD, Constantine poured the unimaginable wealth of the Roman state into transforming Byzantium into Constantinople, the city of Constantine. Think of the scale. marble pillars ripped from ancient temples and shipped hundreds of miles, new forums, new hippodromes, cisterns big enough to hold years of water supply, and new impregnable walls that would stand against invaders for over 1,000 years. He didn't just rebuild Rome, he outshone it. He built a Christian city, a metropolis designed to be the undisputed center of the world, bathed in gold and shimmering mosaics, a literal beacon of light against the gathering storm of the West. While the Visigoths were learning how to wear Roman boots and the Vandals were eyeing the provinces, Constantine was creating an eternal fortress. This grand, dramatic act of relocation, moving the capital 900 miles away from the barbarians, is the moment the Roman Empire truly split, not just politically, but culturally and spiritually. The East became the inheritor, the resilient guardian of law, culture, and power. The West became the tragic ruin, slowly choking on its own inability to adapt. And this is where our story truly begins. In the shadow of those new, towering walls, in the opulent court where Greek, not Latin, was slowly becoming the language of power, and where the emperor was no longer merely a princeps, but a sacred, divinely appointed ruler who commanded both the armies and the church. Prepare yourself, because the next 1,123 years are a relentless tidal wave of spectacular triumphs, incomprehensible betrayals, and survival against odds that defy logic. Welcome to Byzantium. The man who built the city of ultimate destiny could not defy the ultimate fate. In 337 AD, Constantine the Great, the architect of this new world, breathed his last. But the sheer gravitational pull of the city he left behind was a force no earthly power could dismantle. It was an unstoppable engine, even if the drivers were constantly changing. 3 sons divided the inheritance, and as always happens when kings die, the wolves gathered at the borders, sniffing for weakness. It was a period of brutal instability, known in the dusty historical books as the Constantinian dynasty, where brother fought brother and cousin plotted against cousin, all while the walls of the West were cracking under the strain of unimaginable pressure. The empire was cannibalizing itself even as the barbarians sharpened their blades. The true transformation of the state, however, arrived with Theodosius I, a man whose shadow still looms large over the history of faith and governance. Constantine had made Christianity legal. Theodosius made it the only state religion of the empire in 380 AD. This was a decree that shook the very foundations of the ancient world to their core. The pagan temples, which had stood for millennia, monuments to generations of Roman piety, were suddenly silent, their ancient rituals outlawed, their magnificent statues toppled or defaced by zealous mobs. The Olympian gods were officially dethroned by decree of the Roman emperor. This was a cultural shift more radical than any conquest, cementing Byzantium's identity not just as Roman, but as supremely Christian. He solidified the Nicene Creed, fighting the relentless theological wars that raged hotter and more fiercely than any battlefield conflict with the Goths. Remember this critical point. In Byzantium, theology was not an academic pastime, it was state policy, an absolute matter of imperial security. Whether Christ was of the same substance, homoousios, as the Father, or of a similar substance, homoiousios, could literally decide whether bishops were exiled, whether an entire province revolted, or whether the emperor survived the year. This was the unique Byzantine obsession, where arguments over the divine nature of the sun required armed guards in the streets and full-scale imperial councils to settle. They cared about salvation and orthodoxy with a fervor the West simply could not comprehend. But Theodosius committed the greatest tragedy of the Roman world, a mistake born of tradition, not malice, that ensured the final, decisive split. In 395 AD, upon his death, he formally divided the enormous imperial administration between his two utterly ineffective, spoiled sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. This was meant to be a temporary administrative convenience, allowing for easier governance across the vast Mediterranean world, but it became a permanent, catastrophic fracture. The Western Roman Empire, centered first in Rome and then the swamp fortress of Ravenna, was already bleeding out, struggling desperately to manage the overwhelming tidal wave migration of peoples. The Visigoths, the Vandals, the Suebi, all seeking refuge, land, or loot within the borders. Meanwhile, Constantinople, the jewel of the East, watched the implosion from behind its formidable, unbreached defenses. Crucially, the Eastern Court made the cold, hard survivalist calculation. They invested their precious gold in their finest legions, not in the fruitless defense of the collapsing West, but in the absolute, unquestionable survival of the true Roman legacy located on the Bosphorus. They focused on trade routes, managing their internal economy, and building infrastructure. Their resources were channeled into the greatest defensive engineering feat of the age, the legendary Theodosian walls. Then came the sound that terrified the entire known world, the thunder of horses, the guttural roar of the Huns. Attila, the man history would rightly call the scourge of God, was not just a warlord. He was a natural disaster given terrifying, charismatic human form. His devastating empire stretched across the vast Eurasian plains. His name was whispered in fear from the Danube to the Euphrates, and his target was the ultimate, shimmering prize, the riches of Constantinople itself. The already crippled Western Empire simply crumbled before him, paying ruinous tribute in silver and slaves, watching their cities burn to ashes. But the East had that secret weapon, one that Constantine had merely planned, but which Theodosius II finally completed and perfected, the absolutely impenetrable Theodosian walls. This was no mere single-layered defensive perimeter. It was a triple-layered, 70-foot-thick monstrosity of stone and brick, fronted by a deep 70-foot-wide moat and a fortified outer terrace. It was a masterpiece of military engineering. Engineers today still marvel at its complexity and resilience, designed to withstand the siege engines of any possible foe. When Attila, the conqueror of nations, rode up to these colossal defenses in 447 AD, expecting the usual Roman surrender or panicked payment, he met a silent, unyielding mountain of stone that stretched from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. He could not breach it. He could not bypass it. Instead of fighting an unwinnable siege, the ruthless emperors in Constantinople employed the greatest weapon they possessed, one far more effective than spears or cavalry: gold. Mountains of dazzling, untraceable Byzantine gold. They essentially paid Attila an astronomical yearly protection racket, a crippling yearly bribe, to leave their territory untouched and, critically, to turn his destructive attention westward. While the Goths, the Vandals, and the Huns tore the western provinces to shreds, sacking Rome multiple times, shattering the last great legions, and establishing new kingdoms on Roman soil, Constantinople remained absolutely untouched, a beacon of civilization in a world gone dark. It was a cold, dark calculation, a survival strategy so ruthless it defined the empire for the next 1,000 years. They allowed the West to be consumed, ensuring their own immortality. Then came the year 476 AD, a date etched in the memory of every historian, a date that marked the official, ignominious, and almost silent end of the Western Roman Empire. A Germanic general named Odoacer simply deposed the last child emperor, Romulus Augustulus, a name that tragically evoked both the founder of Rome and the founder of the empire, and sent the imperial regalia, the symbols of ultimate power, back to Constantinople. Imagine the moment in the imperial palace. The message arrives. Rome is gone. The line of Caesars that stretched back to Augustus is severed. The emperor in Constantinople, Zeno, was now the sole, legitimate, recognized ruler of the entire Roman world, legally holding dominion over both East and West. The empire was now smaller geographically, but infinitely more focused, strategically positioned, and far richer. The dream Constantine had initiated was now realized. Rome had not fallen. Rome had merely consolidated its power within the impregnable walls of the greatest city the world had ever known. The stage was set for the next terrifying act of survival and resurgence, no longer distracted by the fading shadow of the West. We are now truly in Byzantium, the undisputed inheritor of Caesar and the Church, about to face the man who would try to restore the glory that had been lost. The shadow of the West was long, but it was receding, leaving behind a colossal vacuum of power that only one man dared to fill. That man was Justinian, a peasant son from the Balkans, who, through ruthless ambition and an iron will, found himself seated on the throne of Constantine, obsessed with a single impossible goal: to reclaim Rome. This wasn't merely political maneuvering. This was destiny demanding a rerun. Justinian looked at the ragged remnants of the Western Empire, overrun by Goths, Vandals, and Franks, and saw not failure, but stolen property that needed immediate repossession. He believed it was his sacred duty to restore the Mediterranean to its unified Roman glory. But ambition requires muscle, and Justinian's empire-sized ego was backed by the greatest military general the Byzantines would ever produce, Flavius Belisarius, the last true Roman general, a man capable of victory against impossible odds. She was a former actress, a street survivor, and a courtesan, a background that horrified the conservative aristocracy. But where others saw scandal, Justinian saw fire and an unbreakable will, recognizing in her the only soul capable of matching his own ruthless drive. Their rule was a high-wire act of absolute authority, but in 532 AD, the tightrope snapped. It began, unbelievably, as a dispute between chariot racing fans, the political factions known as the Blues and the Greens. These weren't mere fan clubs. They were armed, powerful paramilitary organizations, and their discontent exploded into the most terrifying urban rebellion in Roman history, the Nika riots. Nika! Victory! Was their battle cry as they surged through the streets. They weren't just protesting. They were burning the city to the ground. For 5 days, Constantinople was engulfed in a storm of anarchy and flame. The magnificent Hagia Sophia was reduced to ash. Half the population was running for their lives, and the enraged mob surrounded the imperial palace, demanding Justinian's execution. But then Theodora, the actress turned empress, stepped forward. The air chilled in the throne room as she delivered a defiant, chilling rebuke to the panicked men around her, a speech that ensured her immortalization in history. She declared that she would not flee, asserting that the imperial purple made the noblest shroud. To run was to live in ignominy. To stay was to die as a ruler. That single terrifying moment of courage shamed Justinian into action and saved the empire from immediate collapse. With the internal threat neutralized by Theodora's iron spine, Justinian finally turned his gaze across the sea. The great gamble was on. He deployed Belisarius to conquer North Africa from the Vandals, a campaign executed with shocking speed and surgical precision. The Mediterranean world watched in disbelief as the Vandal kingdom, once a terror of the seas, collapsed almost instantly. The first piece of the ancient Roman heartland was reclaimed. The next target, Italy, the cradle of civilization itself. The Gothic Wars began, a brutal, decades-long struggle to dislodge the Germanic tribes who had made Rome their capital. Belisarius marched, and for a glorious, brief moment, Rome was once again governed from Constantinople. The map of the empire swelled dramatically, stretching from Spain to the Euphrates. The Renovatio Imperii, the renewal of the empire, was complete. Justinian had achieved the impossible dream, forging an empire worthy of Caesar himself. Justinian himself contracted the disease, barely surviving, emerging a broken, paranoid shadow of his former self. The reconquest was successful, but the empire was fatally hollowed out, its resources spent, its workforce decimated by the invisible killer. The dream had been realized, but the price was the Byzantine future, mortgaged entirely for the ghost of the Roman past. The stage was set for a new, desperate struggle against existential threats, fought by an empire too exhausted to fully defend its own impossible conquests. Constantine was dead. The man who had carved a miracle city out of sheer willpower vanished, leaving behind a power vacuum soaked in paranoia and blood. His sons, instead of uniting the impossible inheritance, immediately turned on each other in a grotesque scramble for the purple, ensuring that the fragile peace of the new Rome was shattered from within before the barbarians even knocked. This wasn't the peaceful transition of a golden age. This was the brutal, desperate reality of surviving Rome's collapse in real time, where trust was a fatal luxury. Constantius II, the ultimate survivor among the heirs, held the East through sheer cunning and ruthless purges, navigating a maze of theological warfare that was just as deadly as any external invasion. Every single bishop was a general in this new, terrifying landscape, and every sermon was a declaration of war, testing the fragile Christian foundation of the new Rome to its absolute breaking point. The capital was holding, but the rest of the empire was fraying. Caught between the philosophical revival of Julian the Apostate, who tried desperately to wrench the empire back to the old gods, plunging the entire state into a spiritual civil war, and the overwhelming, terrifying pressure rising in the north. The barbarians were no longer just raiders, they were migrants, nations on the move, pushed by an even darker force, smashing into the porous western borders. The West received Honorius, a child reportedly obsessed with raising pet chickens, who watched his generals fail and his cities burn from the safe, distant lagoon fortress of Ravenna. He trusted that the barbarians were just a temporary, passing phase, never grasping the scale of the extinction event crashing down upon him. The East received Arcadius, equally weak in command, but protected by the almost supernatural foresight of Constantine's positioning and the sheer institutional depth of the new bureaucracy. This decision, dividing the inheritance, became the great schism of history, sealing the doom of the West forever and saving the East by finally, surgically cutting off the dead, poisoned weight. While the Vandals danced in the ruins of Carthage and the Visigoths under Alaric prepared their terrifying siege instruments for the unthinkable sack of Rome itself, the Eastern Empire played a different, infinitely colder game. They didn't commit to fighting every doomed, expensive battle. They bought time, they bribed, they diverted. They literally weaponized their vast stores of gold, turning the hungry barbarian hordes away from the Bosphorus and pointing them directly, ruthlessly, at the dissolving western frontiers. These walls weren't just stone and mortar. They were a geometric, defensive impossibility, a 7-kilometer shield of pure, layered defiance, designed meticulously to swallow siege engines whole and laugh at the greatest, most devastating armies the savage world could ever muster. They featured a moat, an outer terrace, a low wall, and the colossal inner wall, creating a killing zone of unmatched lethality. No general, no king, no conqueror who looked upon that triple barrier of stone had ever faced anything remotely like it. They became the ultimate psychological weapon, whispering an impossible, divine promise to the citizens cowering inside. You are safe. The entire known world may be ending, the flames may be licking the shores, but you, here, are safe inside the new Rome. And then came the beast that tested that promise to the absolute limit, Attila the Hun. A name whispered in terror from the Rhine to the Euphrates, a man who claimed to hold the actual divine sword of Mars, the living embodiment of divine apocalyptic punishment. He smashed through the Balkans like an uncontrollable tidal wave, demanding tribute with the iron fist of a true force of nature, leaving mountains of ash where thriving Roman cities once proudly stood. Constantinople stared down the barrel of annihilation. Attila demanded tribute, not just gold, but absolute subservience and a humiliating land grant. The Byzantine response, under the leadership of the pragmatic court, was a masterpiece of geopolitical manipulation mixed with sheer, desperate, paralyzing fear. They paid him, yes, they paid him staggering, ruinous amounts of gold, emptying the imperial treasury just to keep his terrifying shadow moving. But the true cynical genius lay in strategic deflection. They kept him laser-focused on the softer target of the West, on the rotting underbelly of the Roman world, using diplomatic guile and enormous sums of cash to ensure his terrifying gaze remained fixed on the fields of Gaul and the soft, rich landscape of Italy, away from the glittering, heavily defended prize of the Golden Horn. The West was now definitively gone. Odoacer deposed the last pathetic Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476 AD. A date that screams the end of an entire civilization. But in Constantinople, protected behind their walls, they barely even noticed. They were still Rome. They had survived the deluge, not through fighting the hardest, but through strategy, architectural defiance, and the merciless sacrifice of their Western cousins. Their focus now turned entirely inward, to defining their unique Orthodox Christian identity, perfecting the terrifying machinery of statecraft, and preparing for the next, inevitable 1,000-year war for survival. The stage was set for the impossible reconquest of the lost legacy. But first, they needed a true imperial Caesar to lead them out of the darkness and into the golden, unforgiving age of Justinian. The darkness lifted, not by the slow crawl of dawn, but by a flash of blinding, unstoppable ambition. This was Justinian, the man who would redefine what it meant to be Roman, a figure whose very existence was a relentless 24-hour campaign against the entropy of history. He was the sleepless emperor, a man driven by a singular, consuming fire, the absolute, non-negotiable restoration of the former Western Empire, a dream so vast it bordered on divine madness. He was not born in the purple. He clawed his way to the top from the rough lands of Illyricum, an outsider leveraging the power of his uncle Justin I to seize the ultimate prize. The moment he sat upon the throne in 527 AD, the bureaucratic machinery of Constantinople shuddered, knowing that the era of quiet maintenance was brutally over. Justinian immediately began planning the Renovatio Imperiae, the restoration of the empire, a project so audacious that generations of previous emperors had dismissed it as political suicide. He saw the barbarian kingdoms of the West, the Vandal, the Ostrogoth, the Visigoth, not as legitimate states, but as temporary squatters occupying stolen Roman land. But no Caesar, however great, rules alone, and behind Justinian stood a woman whose legend burns brighter and far more dangerously than his own, the Empress Theodora. She was a woman ripped from the shadows of the Hippodrome, a former actress whose past was whispered about in the highest courts of Constantinople with a mix of scandal, terror, and awe. Their marriage was an earthquake, shaking the established aristocracy to its very foundations, yet it was an unbreakable union of iron will and relentless vision. She was the one who could see the angles Justinian missed, the one who held the reins of power with a ruthlessness he sometimes lacked. Theodora was not merely a consort. She was a co-emperor in every sense of the word, a strategic genius who understood the brutal necessities of survival, a living testament to the fact that power in the new Rome was not just inherited, but seized. Justinian's grand plans for renewal were almost instantly choked by the very city he sought to glorify. Beneath the gilded surface of Constantinople, a terrifying monster lurked: the Hippodrome factions, the Blues and the Greens. These were not mere chariot racing fan clubs. They were heavily armed, politically charged militias that controlled the pulse of the capital, vying for influence, economic control, and theological dominance. Their rivalry was an eternal, bloody sport, but when they turned their shared venom against the throne, the empire trembled. In January 532 AD, a single spark ignited the fuel of years of resentment against Justinian's high taxes and powerful ministers, especially the hated financial overseer, John the Cappadocian. The two rival factions, momentarily forgetting their ancient blood-soaked hatred, united under a single terrifying roar: "Nika! Conquer!" The word echoed through the streets, a death sentence for the imperial government. The city became a furnace. Fires devoured the ancient Senate House, gutted churches, and threatened the rising majesty of the original Hagia Sophia. For 5 days, anarchy reigned supreme. The mobs, emboldened by their success, did the unthinkable. They declared a new emperor, Hypatius, nephew of the disgraced Anastasius, attempting a complete regime change under the cover of smoke and chaos. Justinian, paralyzed and broken, his grand vision turning to ash, was ready to flee the capital, to abandon the throne and surrender his golden dream to the flames. The guards were mobilized, the ships were waiting in the harbor. The empire was collapsing before it had even truly begun its golden age. It was at this absolute nadir, this moment of ultimate failure, that the Empress Theodora proved her lethal worth. As Justinian huddled, discussing escape routes and the shame of exile, she strode into the imperial council, her face a mask of cold, unyielding resolve. She delivered a speech that would change the course of history, a raw and brutal declaration of imperial dignity. "If flight were the only option," she declared, her voice cutting through the panic, "I would not survive. The purple makes the noblest shroud." She chose death and majesty over life in exile. This was not just rhetoric. It was a challenge that shamed every trembling nobleman in the room. Her sheer courage instantly reignited the spine of the emperor. The time for negotiation was over. The time for butchery had arrived. These two warriors, commanding the loyal Germanic and Herulian mercenaries, were dispatched to the epicenter of the riot, the Hippodrome, where the massive crowd of rioters were carelessly celebrating their supposed victory and crowning their puppet emperor. The Nika riots were over, and Justinian learned the ultimate, terrifying lesson. To restore the empire, he first had to crush the heart of the capital itself, ensuring that only one voice mattered. This colossal effort resulted in the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, 1,000 years of Roman jurisprudence boiled down into a single, cohesive, and ruthlessly efficient text. It was the intellectual foundation of the restored empire, the backbone of modern Western law, and the ultimate declaration that Rome still ruled, even if only through ink and parchment. The stage was now truly set. The money was collected, the laws were written, the internal opposition was massacred and terrified into silence, and the generals, Belisarius and Narses, were itching for glory and the promise of ancient conquest. The first target was obvious, tempting, and necessary: the Vandals, the descendants of the very tribe that sacked Rome centuries earlier, who had seized the rich North African provinces, crippling Rome's vital grain supply. The reconquest was no longer a dream whispered in the imperial chambers. It was an armada assembling in the harbor, a massive fleet ready to sail into the stormy, unforgiving seas of the lost West. The Golden Age was about to begin, purchased in blood and driven by the unstoppable, sleepless ambition of one man and the lethal resolve of his empress. The world was about to remember the true, terrible meaning of the word Roman. The three surviving sons, Constantine II, Constans, and Constantius II, slaughtered their way to a shaky, fragmented peace, carving the colossal territory like vultures over a fresh carcass. Yet, through this internecine carnage, the new capital remained unnervingly stable, shielded by its immense distance from the toxic political swamps of Rome and Milan, and bolstered by the loyalty of the formidable Eastern legions, the true engine of Roman power. The city itself, now known universally as Constantinople, was already developing a unique, impenetrable shield, a vast, layered bureaucracy, and an almost religious focus on the accumulation of gold, skills that Rome had long forgotten in its decadent decline. The walls held, the granaries were full, and the Senate, unlike its Western counterpart, knew its place, serving the throne with ruthless efficiency. But no physical fortress could defend against the greatest existential threat to the Constantinian legacy, a threat born from within his own bloodline, a philosopher king trained for the church but destined to become history's most notorious renegade, Julian the Apostate. Julian was not merely a pagan, he was a brilliant, disciplined intellectual, the last true champion of the old gods, who saw the Christian revolution not as salvation, but as a fatal weakening of the Roman spirit. He ascended to the throne with the terrifying goal of reversing history itself, seeking to scrub the name of Christ from the monumental structures of the empire and restore the ancient temples and sacrifices that had been outlawed. Imagine the psychic shock across the empire. The very man wearing the purple, the successor to the man who legalized Christianity, was suddenly demanding the return of Jupiter, Mars, and the entire Olympian pantheon. This was a cosmic gamble, a battle waged not with swords, but with theology, philosophy, and subtle, often brutal administrative pressure. Julian mocked the Christians, closed their schools, and sought to prove the superiority of the Hellenic tradition through sheer intellectual might and military success. He was a terrifyingly competent general, leading daring campaigns against the Germanic tribes and securing the northern frontier with cold efficiency. During a chaotic skirmish, Julian was struck by a spear. The source remains a historical mystery, though some whisper of a Christian assassin or even a desperate Roman soldier fearing the outcome of the campaign. Julian died, allegedly crying out, "Thou hast conquered, O Galilean!" His audacious counter-revolution collapsed instantly, ensuring that Constantinople's future would remain inextricably linked to the cross, not the eagle of Jupiter. The Julian crisis proved the lethal fragility of the imperial system, but also the deep, immovable roots of the new faith in the East. But as the empire exhaled in relief, a far more physical, devastating threat was gathering on the Danube, the Goths. This was not a raiding party. This was an entire nation in motion, pushed by the unimaginable horror of the Huns sweeping westward from the steppes. These Visigoths, desperate and starving, begged to be admitted into Roman territory, seeking refuge from the apocalypse behind them. The Emperor Valens, a weak and avaricious man stationed in the east, agreed, but only under conditions of such vicious exploitation that the Goths quickly realized they had traded one tormentor for another. The Roman administrators, famously corrupt, starved the Goths, sold their children into slavery, and treated them with contemptuous cruelty, transforming desperate refugees into bitter, battle-hardened enemies. The inevitable revolt exploded with the fury of 1,000 starving armies, culminating in the single greatest military disaster since Cannae, the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD. Valens, convinced of his own military superiority and eager to steal the glory from his nephew Gratian, rushed into battle without waiting for reinforcements. The Gothic heavy cavalry, an unstoppable force the Romans had not accounted for, smashed the imperial formations. The result was not a defeat, but an annihilation. The Emperor Valens himself was killed, lost on the battlefield, perhaps burned alive in a farmhouse, his body never recovered. 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army were destroyed. The legendary, invincible legions of Rome were proven fragile, and the barbarians were now right on the doorstep of Constantinople, tasting the weakness of the imperial core. The Goths swept across the Balkans unhindered, but they hit the impregnable walls of the new Rome and faltered. The city, still young, still raw, showed its first flash of ultimate, terrifying resilience. The city militia, bolstered by naval power and the absolute refusal to panic, beat back the initial assaults. The empire was saved from immediate destruction, but it was reeling. The vacuum left by Valence's death and the annihilation of his army demanded a general of impossible competence, a man who could somehow tame the Goths without losing the entire eastern frontier. That man was Theodosius, later known as Theodosius the Great. Theodosius was a masterful strategist, not through victory in battle, which he avoided when possible, but through a brilliant, subtle, and fundamentally necessary political maneuver. He understood that the Goths could not be defeated conventionally after Adrianople. They had to be assimilated. He brokered a treaty, allowing the Goths to settle within the empire as foederati, allies who fought for Rome but were governed by their own tribal leaders. This was a poisoned chalice. It saved the immediate crisis, but introduced a massive, hostile, autonomous military presence deep within imperial lands, a ticking time bomb for the centuries to come. But Theodosius's most profound, lasting legacy was not military, it was spiritual. He was fiercely Nicene, and in 380 AD he issued the Edict of Thessalonica, formally declaring Nicene Christianity the sole legitimate religion of the Roman state, making heresy a crime and beginning the final systematic dismantling of all official pagan worship. This act finalized the divorce between the old, dying, pagan Rome and the new, vibrant Christian Constantinople. Theodosius was the last man to rule both the eastern and western halves of the empire. His death in 395 AD saw the final, definitive split. The west, given to his weak son Honorius, and the east, the true Roman Empire, given to his equally ineffectual son Arcadius. The West was now on a fatal, inexorable slide toward ruin, its treasury empty, its borders porous, and its emperors puppets. The East, however, was safe behind its formidable walls, ruled by a bureaucracy that prioritized survival and tax collection above all else. The new walls that would bear Theodosius's name were already being planned, a monumental barrier of stone and ditch, signaling to the world that Constantinople had no intention of sharing the fate of its doomed sibling. The world watched as the western sun set in fire and blood, but the light of the east, burning bright and orthodox, only intensified. The Roman Empire was about to shed its last vestiges of Latin heritage and fully embrace its destiny as the Greek-Christian unstoppable fortress perched between two worlds. The survival story was just beginning to hit its stride. The Byzantine Empire had declared its independence from the ghost of Rome, settling into the opulent, gold-threaded life of Constantinople, a city built on determination and divine favor. But the very moment they stood ready to claim this new destiny, the universe decided to test the structural integrity of their audacious experiment, launching threats both physical and terrifyingly spiritual against their very foundations. The first challenge arrived on horseback, a terrifying shadow cast across the plains of Europe, a shadow that swallowed entire nations whole and spat out their ruined bones. We are talking, of course, about the nightmare known as the Huns, led by the infamous Scourge of God, Attila himself. While the West crumbled into petty kingdoms of barbarian warlords, a slow, agonizing death witnessed by no one but historians, Constantinople faced the immediate, cataclysmic threat of total annihilation, and they knew exactly how to prepare for it. They didn't rely on legions scattered across distant, useless frontiers. They relied on stone and engineering brilliance. This was the era of the legendary Theodosian walls, a defensive structure so epic, so impossibly strong, that it would define siege warfare for the next 1,000 years. Imagine a triple line of insurmountable stone, a moat of terror, an outer wall and an inner wall that scraped the clouds, bristling with towers placed exactly 60 yards apart. When Attila, the man who demanded payment in gold just to not invade you, finally turned his gaze toward the shining jewel of Constantinople, he found not a soft target, but a geometrically perfect, impenetrable fortress. Attila's horses turned away, his terror-inducing army thwarted, not by a massive battle, but by sheer, overwhelming stone superiority. He knew, everyone knew, that assaulting those walls was suicide. The physical survival of the Eastern Empire was secured, etched in the very bedrock of the Theodosian defense system. But external threats, however terrifying, are often less lethal than internal schisms, and the true danger that nearly ripped the empire apart was not the sword of the barbarian, but the razor-sharp edge of theological disagreement. This was the first great, defining crisis of the Greek Christian Empire. If you thought political fights over tax rates were vicious, try watching bishops debate the exact metaphysical nature of God made flesh. This was not merely an academic exercise. This was an existential, soul-shattering civil war conducted with ink and dogma, determining the very fabric of salvation. The core conflict was monophysitism versus diophysitism. Simplified, the question was, did Christ possess one nature, monophysis, a divine nature that completely absorbed the human one, or two distinct natures, diophysis, human and divine, existing perfectly side by side? This seems arcane, but the implications were staggering, reaching into the heart of imperial authority and popular belief, particularly in the critical, wealthy provinces of Egypt and Syria. The stakes were so high that bishops traveled across the seas, followed by their private armies of zealous monks, ready to settle theological points with blunt force. Think of it as the ultimate church rumble, played out across the grand stages of ecumenical councils. The air was thick with intrigue, manipulation, and heresy accusations. The first major attempt to settle this volatile question failed spectacularly at the Robber Council of Ephesus, a farce where imperial legates were beaten and opposing bishops were literally silenced through violence, proving that the early church truly understood high-stakes drama. This theological chaos threatened to fracture the entire eastern half of the Roman legacy, turning the crucial agricultural and trade centers against Constantinople's central authority. The empire needed a definitive, terrifyingly binding statement, and they needed an emperor strong enough to enforce it. Enter Empress Pulcheria once more, now ruling with her chosen husband Marcian. They recognized that the future of the empire depended on establishing firm, uncompromising orthodoxy, especially since the powerful patriarchates of Alexandria and Antioch were challenging Constantinople's supremacy. The stage was set for the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD, perhaps the most pivotal moment in Christian history since the Council of Nicaea. Imagine hundreds of furious, sleep-deprived bishops sweating under the pressure of imperial decree, their every word scrutinized by the powerful government officials watching over them. The result was the Chalcedonian definition, a carefully crafted statement declaring that Christ existed in two natures, without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. It was the ultimate compromise, mathematically precise and ruthlessly pragmatic. But in defining orthodoxy, They simultaneously defined schism. The powerful ancient churches of Egypt and Syria, the Coptic and Syriac traditions, rejected this definition utterly, viewing it as a betrayal of the true faith, clinging to the monophysite doctrine. They refused to yield, creating a permanent, seismic religious rift across the Byzantine world. Constantinople had secured its walls against Attila, but in securing its soul at Chalcedon, it permanently alienated crucial parts of its own population, creating religious fault lines that future enemies would exploit with horrifying success. The empire survived the Hunnic terror, yes, but it entered a new, painful phase. The age of internal religious civil war, where the emperor's duty became not just ruling the territory, but defining and defending the one true path to God, often at the cost of unifying the state itself. The survival story had moved from external military defense to internal spiritual policing, a drama that would only intensify with time. This volatile mixture of doctrinal purity and ruthless statecraft was the defining hallmark of the early Byzantine spirit, a spirit forged in fire and defined by an unwavering, sometimes brutal, commitment to the truth as interpreted from the high seat of the imperial city. The next act would see this same unwavering focus lead to an explosion of imperial power that would temporarily reclaim the glory of the old Roman world, driven by a man whose name still echoes through history like thunder. The stage was set, the fortress built, and now the true inheritor of Rome stepped into the blinding light of history. This was not the timid successor of a collapsing empire. This was a force of nature dressed in imperial purple, a man who saw the shattered pieces of the Western Roman Empire not as lost ruins, but as territory temporarily misplaced. Justinian I was not born to the purple. He was a peasant from the Balkans, driven by an ambition so vast it threatened to consume the known world. He slept only 3 hours a night, fueling his administrative genius with sheer, unyielding obsession. He was not content merely to protect the walls of Constantinople. He saw the ghosts of legions marching through the ruined forums of the West, and he heard the cries of the lost Roman people still suffering under the rule of barbarian kings. His mission was not merely survival, but the absolute and total restoration of Rome, a project that required both relentless lawmaking and rivers of blood. But behind every great, terrifying man stands an even more terrifying woman. Enter Theodora. Her story, whispered across the empire, was a tale of scandal and audacity. A former actress, a woman of the theater whose past was so scandalous that it defied the rigid mores of the capital. Yet she was elevated to co-ruler, an empress whose authority was absolute. Their partnership was the most explosive political cocktail the world had ever witnessed. Justinian, the tireless architect of law and logistics, and Theodora, the sharp, ruthless pragmatist who understood the dark heart of power better than any senator. Their combined will was the engine that powered the Golden Age, but first, they had to survive a challenge that nearly brought their shining city to ash before the great work even began. The year 532 A.D. The city was a powder keg, the people divided not by politics, but by the reckless, murderous loyalty to the chariot racing teams, the Blues and the Greens. These factions were not mere sports fans, they were organized political gangs, powerful enough to challenge the emperor himself. When several members of the factions were sentenced to death for murder, the city revolted. It was a massive, spontaneous combustion of rage against high taxes, imperial arrogance, and the perceived corruption of the regime. Their collective roar echoed across the forum. Nika! Victory. They did not want the Blues or the Greens to win the race. They wanted Justinian to fall. The city became a colossal battleground. Within days, half of Constantinople was engulfed in flames. The great Senate House burned. The Hippodrome, the very source of the tension, was now the staging ground for a full-scale revolution. Justinian, seeing his grand vision disintegrate before his eyes, prepared the ships for flight. The greatest emperor in Byzantine history was ready to abandon his throne, his city, and his dream, cowering before the rage of the mob. The history of the Roman world was about to pivot on a single moment of cowardice. But then the empress stepped forward. Theodora, the woman whose past was supposedly weak, stood before the terrified council of generals and administrators and delivered a speech that became the stuff of legend, a brutal, uncompromising manifesto of imperial destiny. For men who have once been emperors, it is unendurable to be refugees, she declared, her voice slicing through the panic. May I never live to see the day when I am not saluted as empress. If you wish to flee, Caesar, well and good. You have the money, the sea is open, and there are the ships. But I choose the ancient saying that the purple makes the noblest shroud. The message was clear. She would rather be buried in the color of sovereignty than live in exile. This single, defiant declaration stiffened the spines of the terrified men. Theodora had saved the empire. Justinian, shamed and galvanized, immediately unleashed his two greatest commanders, Belisarius and Narses, two figures who represented the apex of Roman military genius. Belisarius, the young, brilliant strategist, was sent into the Hippodrome. The city was devastated, but Justinian did not mourn the ashes, he saw opportunity. He immediately launched the most ambitious building project in Roman history, constructing the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, a dome so vast, so impossibly majestic, that it was said to float on air, proclaiming to the world that this Christian Rome was the ultimate seat of God's favor. With domestic dissent crushed and the capital rebuilt in glittering marble, Justinian turned his gaze back to the west, towards the lost provinces, the ancestral heartland, and the barbarian kingdoms who had dared to claim Roman land. The time for restoration had come. The first target was North Africa, ruled by the Vandal kingdom, a rich but internally fragile realm. The man tasked with this impossible mission was Flavius Belisarius, perhaps the most strategically astute general since Julius Caesar himself. In 533 AD, a massive invasion force, small by ancient standards but enormous for the depleted East, sailed across the Mediterranean. The Vandals, decadent and unprepared, were taken completely by surprise. Belisarius moved with blinding speed. The Battle of Ad Decimum was a tactical masterpiece, leading directly to the capture of the Vandal capital, Carthage. Within a single year, the entire Vandal kingdom, which had defied the West for a century, collapsed like a house of cards. Africa was Rome's again. The glory was intoxicating. But this victory was merely the appetizer for the main, deadly course. Italy itself, the ancestral home, ruled by the powerful and deeply entrenched Ostrogoth kingdom. This would not be a swift campaign. This would be a brutal, agonizing 20-year war, a conflict that would bleed the empire dry and utterly destroy the very land it sought to reclaim. Justinian's ambition was limitless, but the cost of that ambition was about to become astronomical, turning the joyous sound of reconquest into a decade-long scream of suffering. Justinian had won the West, yes, but victory tasted like ash and debt, a poisoned cup handed to the next generation of doomed emperors who had to grapple with the agonizing aftermath. The price of Roman restoration was the utter exhaustion of the East, draining the coffers that were supposed to defend the true, irreplaceable heartland, the unstoppable walls of Constantinople itself. His legions, scattered across the deserts of Africa and the smoking ruins of Italy, were too thin, too few, and too far from home when the real existential storm began to gather on the horizon, not from the west, but from the east and the north. Justinian watched helplessly as his grand vision was undermined not by military defeat, but by the microscopic, invisible enemy that destroyed the tax base, the farm labor, and the very structure of the imperial administration. The empire was wounded, sick, and bleeding cash, making it impossible to hold on to the vast, ruinous territories that had been reclaimed at such an astronomical cost. The instant the grip loosened in the west, the conquered land slipped away like sand. Italy, barely recovered from 2 decades of brutal, fratricidal war between Gothic defender and Roman liberator, was immediately swallowed by a new, terrifying force, the Lombards, a Germanic tribe that didn't just raid, they came to stay, carving out permanent kingdoms in the devastated peninsula only 20 years after the Byzantines declared victory. The mighty Exarchate of Ravenna clung desperately to the coastline and a few strategic cities, a lonely Byzantine outpost in a sea of barbarians, symbolizing the failure of Justinian's lasting legacy in the West, a constant drain on resources that could not be spared. Simultaneously, the Danube frontier dissolved into chaos, forcing the empire to confront its ultimate vulnerability on the European mainland. Waves of terrifying Avars, swift, brutal horsemen demanding crippling annual tribute, and endless streams of Slavic settlers poured over the riverline, overwhelming the remaining fortifications as the imperial army was locked down in the seemingly endless Italian conflict. The Balkans, the ancient recruiting ground for the Roman army, were rapidly turning into a Slavic heartland, pushing the true border of the empire almost to the gates of Thessalonica, the second city. The emperors who followed Justinian, men like Justin II and Tiberius II, found themselves inheriting not an empire restored to glory, but an empire teetering on the razor's edge of total bankruptcy and facing coordinated invasion from 3 directions simultaneously. They desperately needed time, and that time was purchased by the brilliant, tragic Emperor Maurice, a strategist who understood priorities. He recognized that the immediate threat was not the Lombards or the Slavs who could chip away at the edges, but the eternal, disciplined, and massive military might of the Sasanian Persian Empire, the only power truly capable of leveling Constantinople and ending the Roman story forever. By a stunning stroke of diplomatic genius and opportune military aid, Maurice managed to install a friendly Persian Shah, Khosrow II, on the throne in Crethason. This incredible feat stabilized the Eastern Front for a crucial 2 decades, buying the precious breathing room the empire desperately needed to deal with the overwhelming Balkan threat and to save its dwindling treasury. Maurice poured his focus into the Avars and Slavs, reclaiming lost territory and reforming the army by creating the first true military districts, the Exarchates, preparing for a long, grueling siege of survival. But survival demanded sacrifice, and Maurice's absolute obsession with fiscal responsibility led inevitably to his tragic downfall and the undoing of all his meticulous work. When he refused to pay ransom for 12,000 captured soldiers, deeming the price too high, and then ordered his exhausted, victorious army to winter beyond the freezing Danube, the legions revolted, unable to bear the perceived abandonment. This was not a border skirmish. This was the ultimate, scorched-earth war for survival, a conflict that would define the next century of history and push Byzantium closer to annihilation than any crisis before or since. Under the monstrous tyranny and military incompetence of Phocas, who spent his time murdering anyone he suspected of disloyalty, the eastern defenses dissolved like salt in water. City after city fell in swift, devastating succession. Antioch, Damascus, and then the unthinkable happened. Jerusalem itself was captured in 614 AD. The sacred relic of the true cross, the holiest object in the Christian world, was seized by the Persians and carried back to Ctesiphon in a catastrophic humiliation that echoed across the Christian world, shattering morale and faith in the emperor. Phocas, paralyzed by paranoia and focused only on eliminating internal dissent with barbaric cruelty, could offer no organized resistance, watching helplessly as the wealthiest provinces, the grain basket of Egypt and the trading heart of Syria and Anatolia, were brutally cut off by the unstoppable Persian tide. The empire stood naked, stripped down to Anatolia, the Balkan coast, and the defiant walls of Constantinople itself. The Persian army camped literally across the Bosporus, their campfires visible from the Golden Horn, a terrifying sign of imminent total defeat. The 6th century had ended not with Justinian's triumphant restoration, but with an apocalyptic crisis that had reduced the 1,000-year-old state to its knees. The people whispered that God had finally abandoned Rome. They desperately needed a miracle, a true hero to stand against the overwhelming Persian tide. And that savior was sailing toward the capital right now, emerging from the relative safety of the last remaining stable province, Roman Africa.